Namaskar. I welcome you all in the third lecture of the first module of Stress Management course. This lecture is devoted to the understanding of different perspectives of stress. Let's have a quick review of what we are going to learn today. We will be talking about the variables which were considered similar to stress in the researches done in early 60s and 70s. Thereafter, we will move on to the different perspectives of stress, which are conceptual, psychological, and evolutionary. And then we will further elaborate upon the conceptual perspectives, namely stimulus, response, and transactional perspective. See, perspective is a way of looking at a situation. If I say psychological perspective, it means I'm adopting a particular way of understanding human behavior because the ultimate aim of psychology is to understand, explain, and predict human behavior. So, different perspectives developed in the course of researches when researchers tried to look at the same behavioral phenomena from different standpoints. However, all these perspectives add some knowledge to the mechanism of stress, its perception, and the coping behavior. If you look at the literature of 1964 or early 70s, you will find that researchers freely use the term anxiety, conflict, frustration, emotional disturbance, trauma, alienation, anomie interchangeably with stress. Later on, different perspectives on stress developed gradually. Out of these, the conceptual perspectives of stress, psychological perspectives of stress, and evolutionary perspective of stress were the most important one. Conceptual perspectives can be further divided into stimulus perspective, response perspective, and transactional perspectives. Students, if you remember, we have been talking about this division since our earlier lectures. When we were discussing that how the concept of stress migrated from physical sciences to biological science and then to behavioral science, we also talked about how the shift gave rise to various focal points in understanding stress. For example, when the external environment is supposed to be important, it becomes the stimulus perspective, means there must be an environmental stimulus to elicit a stress response. When it moved on to biological perspectives, Hans Selye came in and he started defining stress as a non-specific bodily reaction to any noxious stimulus. It became the response perspective. And when Lazarus came into the scene and he tried to bridge the gap between these two perspectives by taking into account both organism and the environment, it became the transactional perspective. Let's see what these perspectives suggest. First of all, we will be dealing with the stimulus perspective. So, of course, as we talked earlier also, here the stress is conceived as a function of stressors. So, if someone is exposed to a situation which is considered stressful, the person would definitely feel stressed. Now, exposure of stressors is inevitable because we continuously interact with our external environment and this interaction cannot be stopped. The environment is full of a variety of stimuli and all of them may not be very congenial for us. So, we have to be exposed to one or the other kind of a stressor. What happens when a person comes across such a stressor is building up of inner tension, which is later on perceived as a stress. Moreover, the stressors are not fixed. They keep on changing with the socio-cultural milieu. When the society changes, when the situation changes, when the environment changes, human beings come across to new stressors while Others may get eradicated. Not much earlier, when we all were traumatized by the presence of COVID 19, a very novel stressor in our environment, whereas polio has been eradicated due to an extensive correction program. So, this is an example that stressors keep on changing. I have given here a comparative account of the common stressors of 1970s which I could found in the books and the common stressors of 2020s which we all are experiencing, right? So if you look at the first part of the slide, you will find that in 1970s there was an unequal distribution of wealth. Some people were wealthy but the poor were very poor. Health facilities were not very good. Then rapid social change was taking place due to industrialization. That was also taken as a stressor by people. That now the culture is changing, the society is changing, the work culture is changing as well. Then another threat frequently reported in the literature of 1970s was a threat to social or cultural identity of a community. Social and cultural identity, religious identity, has been something very close to our overall identity. And people are usually very sensitive about it. So, at any point of time, if they experience that their identity is under threat, they will react. Internally, they would feel stress. Externally, it may come out as resistance. Moreover, it was interesting to see that due to industrialization, some people were getting jobs and they were earning regular salaries. So, this used to contribute to their increasing purchasing power. And how the society would look at it? They would look at it as a continuous attempt to get luxuries of life. Even that was considered a source of stress because some people can get it, others may not. When people who are not getting these kind of things, who are deprived of such kind of things, start making social comparisons, they would feel stress. And when people who are able to get some of the luxuries, they want to get more and more. And in the process of achieving more and more, they will be striving more and hence getting stress. So that was also a very interesting stressor reported in literatures in 1970s and 80s. Whereas if you compare the list with the list of 2020s, what do you find? We find that poor physical health after COVID-19 is a problem. Physical health has become a problem, not the health related facilities. Now we have so many hospitals. Things are accessible to people. Of course, not all, but most of us. But now we suffer from poor physical health like obesity, like, disorders related with stress, diabetes, and many other type of physical health problems which have aggravated enormously after COVID-19. Substance abuse is a big problem nowadays. Then a novel category of stressors have arrived which are known as internet addiction, gaming addiction, or selfie addiction. People are spending hours and hours on mobile phones and later on they regret because they are not able to get enough time for their important tasks. Social isolation is another stressor which is very common these days. Sleep disturbances are there, cognitive impairments are there. If we are not able to take proper sleep, if we are spending too much time with screen, obviously we will suffer from one or the other kind of cognitive impairment. Now, if I try to summarize some important observations regarding this stimulus perspective, what can we find? See, this perspective assumes that when the individual is struck by a real stressor or even a perceived stressor, the individual would feel stressed. So, presence of a stressor is must to elicit the stress response. No stressor, no stress should be there. This stressor can be external as well as internal, but it must be there. For example, if there is some problem in my body or if there is a headache which I am suffering from, I would feel stressed. I will not feel happy about it. However, It has been found a number of times that the same stressor will not elicit the same kind of response in everyone. The responses may differ qualitatively as well as quantitatively. Quantitatively means in terms of their intensity. If I come across with some stressor, I may be very much disturbed with that. If you come across with the same stressor, you may not feel that much disturbance, although you also feel a little unpleasantness about it. Qualitatively means what kind of perception do I generate when I'm faced with that kind of stress? I can give you a very interesting example. We all take our annual exams, which usually last for 2.5 or 3 hours, right? And in the same examination hall, there are two types of people: students who are taking the exam and the invigilators who are performing their duties. Now, what happens? The situation is very stressful to you because you have to write lots many things and you are constantly worried, what if I miss something important? I have prepared so much. My questions should not be left. I should complete all the questions properly and that too in time. But the invigilator may also be stressed. Why he or she is stressed? He doesn't have to take the test, doesn't have to write the answers. He or she will not be evaluated on the basis of answer scripts. Then why that person is stressed? Because that person has nothing to do for 2.5 hours or 3 hours. He or she is not allowed to do anything except observing you doing your examination, right? The person may have a load of responsibilities pending, and still for 3 hours he or she is not able to perform any of them. So constantly the person is thinking in his mind that, oh, I have to do this, I have to do that, I could have completed this much of work in this much of time. This is a different kind of response, a qualitatively different type of response. The invigilator getting stressed due to completely a different reason. Different kind of perception and experience has been generated, right? So that's why it has been said that the same stressor not necessarily generates the same kind of response in everyone. Correct? Moreover, the response in the same person when come across with the same stressor may differ across the context and over time. At some point of time, I may get very much disturbed. At another point of time, when I have ample of resources and I am supported by many people by my side, I may not feel that much of distressed by the same stressor. Okay. So, no stressor is universal. You cannot prepare a list of a stressor which is stressful for all of us, Similarly, no stimulus is there which is entirely normal for everyone. A stimulus which is considered normal or very less stressful for most of us can create enormous stress in some or few of us. Okay, so there is nothing like a universal stressor. And the second important point to carry is responses differ both quantitatively as well as qualitatively. Here comes the second perspective, the response perspective. This perspective is inspired by the work of Hans Selye. In 1974, we have already talked about this work. We have already talked about the general adaptation syndrome also. And we have discussed the definition of stress by Selye, where he says that it is a non-specific bodily reaction to any noxious stimulus. Right? So, as soon as we start conceptualizing stress in terms of the bodily responses and reactions, it becomes the response perspective. See, you must note that when we shift from one perspective to the other, it doesn't mean that the factors associated with the first perspective are now absent. No, they will be present there. Stressor is also needed, response is also needed. Different perspectives have emerged due to the different focus, different emphasis on these aspects of the situation and the organism. Okay. So this perspective was further supported by Beer, Kaplan, Cobb, French, Harrison, and Pinner in their researches. Now the focus has shifted from the stressor to the subjective perception of the individual of that stressor as well as the ability to cope with it. All the time, we have some environmental demands and we have some capacities to fulfill those demands. Whenever there is a great discrepancy between the two, we start feeling stressed. The general adaptation syndrome came out of this understanding only. The more the discrepancy, the greater the stress. So, we will quickly move from the alarm stage to the resistance stage and finally to the stage of exhaustion if our efforts are not enough to fulfill the environmental demands. The third very important approach in this list is the transactional approach. This very approach tries to connect the stimulus and response perspective and it places greater importance on the dynamic interaction of the organism and its environment. The approach states that due to this dynamic interaction, unique challenges are created. And many times, the conventional solutions are not enough to deal with it. That is why individuals try to think of novel solutions. They try them one by one, sometimes adjusting themselves, sometimes adjusting the environment, and they look for the most effective solution of the problem. Okay. So what happens that the transactional approach basically emphasizes on the cognitive appraisals and the coping strategies. Two very important points to carry with you from here. Cognitive appraisals and coping strategies. We will elaborate upon them. Now, cognitive appraisal means how I evaluate the overall situation. The cognitive appraisal can be of two types. The primary appraisal and the secondary appraisal. So, primary appraisal is basically the cognitive appraisal of demand. Okay, there are two aspects of the situation. One is the demand and another is the resource that we have with us. Okay, so at first level, we try to assess the situation. Okay, what kind of demands are present? How taxing these demands are? So, the assessment of environmental demands and the potential threats involved in losing the situation. What if I'm not able to deal with the stressor successfully? Whenever I try to assess these two things, what is the stressor, how intense it is, how long will it be there in the environment, and what kind of potential harms, threats, or problems are involved with it further. This is called cognitive appraisal of demand. Okay, the abbreviation I'm going to use here is CAD. The next level of appraisal is the secondary appraisal. Here, I'm going to appraise my supplies. Supplies means my resources. Resources means the financial resources, the social support system, whatever I have, the knowledge which I have, okay, or the experience which I have dealing with such kind of situations. Apart from that, my ability, my potential, what do I think, whether I'm capable of dealing with it or not. And then comes the skill part. I know I have the potential, but what if I don't have the skill? What is the difference between these two? Okay, let me take an example. I have the potential to learn addition. Okay? My IQ is okay, my numerical ability is okay, so I can learn addition, the mathematical operation. But I cannot do addition practically unless I learn how to do it. So when you learn the specific methodology of doing something, this is called a skill. So you gradually develop a skill, you learn a skill. Okay. So the second level of appraisal is focused on supplies, what I have, my abilities, my skills, my resources, everything. The abbreviation which I have used here is CAS, Cognitive Appraisal of Supplies. And the perception of stress depends directly on the difference between CAD and CAS. If CAD exceeds CAS, means the situation is stressful, means I assess that the demands are much more than what I have as my supplies. And there are potential threats if I lose the situation. So, this is going to lead to stress. But if CAS is greater than CAD, no issues. I can manage it, that too very comfortably, so no stress. Right? Let's move ahead. Here are some famous quotes. You can find some statements in quote unquote. The first statement is by Apley and Trumbull. This statement was given long back in 1967, but because it is very apt to be mentioned here, I have kept it here. So let's see what it says. Stressfulness of a stimulus exposure or event is dependent upon the pattern of stimulus organism interaction in a particular time and a particular place. This particular statement contains three important facts. Read it again a bit more carefully and try to see what it says. Stressfulness of a stimulus exposure or event is dependent upon means no stimulus or event is having a constant level of stressfulness that is to be perceived by everyone. No. The level of stressfulness that we will perceive depends upon something else. Now, what that else is? The else is the kind of interaction the organism is going to have with the environmental stimulus. Okay. And even further elaboration of this point is that this interaction is not an absolute, but it is in the context of a particular time and in particular place. In India, we have a concept of Desh, Kal and Patra, place, time and person. And we realize, we admit that our behavior is largely contextual. So what is appropriate in one context may not be appropriate in the other one. Similarly, a stressor which may be stressful in one context may not be that stressful or may not be stressful at all in some other context. Okay. So, Apley and Trumbull are trying to explain this particular point that the stressfulness of a stressor may vary depending upon a number of factors. What kind of interaction you are having, what kind of the context is there in which this interaction is taking place, what is the particular framework of time. Okay. Another statement is by Lazarus, and he is trying to extend the idea of non-specific bodily response which is perceived as stress and the idea given initially by Hans Selye. So what he says, the general adaptation syndrome may be precipitated not only by noxious stimuli but by the psychological reactions to physical stimuli also. What Lazarus is trying to do? He is trying to point out that presence of a physical stressor is not always essential to trigger the general adaptation syndrome or the stress reaction in an organism. Sometimes it can simply be triggered by a wrong perception of a particular stimulus which actually presents little or no harm to the organism as being very threatening. You know what happens in phobia? As a psychology student, or even in general, you must have heard the name phobia. People get phobic to different stimulus, which in reality presents either no threat or very little threat to the person. But it is their perception which makes that particular object or situation or stressor very, very intense. Okay, so this is what was proposed by Lazarus in 1975. Another part which was dealt by the transactional approach apart from the cognitive appraisal was coping strategies. It also tries to focus on the way we cope with the situations, the way we try to handle. And it comes up with the conclusion that a person can have an active coping style or a passive coping style. So, an active coping style, what happens? We try to do something, we try to come in action so that we can either change ourselves to fit the environment, or we can change the environment to fit our own demand or what I need from it. Or if single of them is not working, I can try doing both. I can change me a little bit and I can change the environment a little bit. If I'm able to change both these entities to some extent, I may arrive at a new homeostasis, which will reduce my stress. Similarly, we can have a passive coping style. Passive means where the person who is suffering from the stress is not doing anything. So, what if I'm not doing anything? I may be ignoring the problem. Or I may be waiting that the problem will fade away on its own with the passage of time. So I don't have to do anything. The problem will be sorted out on its own. This is called a passive coping approach. Well, I have just presented two aspects of coping. It contains a lot many more. We will be gradually talking and learning about them in later modules. Okay. But at this point, I will keep my discussion limited to active and coping strategies, active and passive coping strategies only. So, this was what we learned today. Let us have a quick recap of that. The first thing we learn about that there are different perspectives to understand stress, its causes, and individuals' responses to it. They can be divided into conceptual perspectives, means different types of conceptualizing stress as a function of a stressor or as a bodily response or as a transaction between the organism or the environment. Then conceptual perspectives involve the stimulus response and transactional perspectives. We have just talked about them. Now, external environment is a main source of stress. However, there may be sufficient diversity in responses towards the same stimulus, giving rise to the response perspective. Further, this response perspective gave way to the transactional perspective, which focuses a lot on the cognitive appraisals and the coping mechanisms of the individuals. So that's all for today. Coming to the activity section, I'm so excited about this section because it gives you an opportunity to try what you have learned in your real life situation. So, what we have today with us that you can try. Okay, so let us turn the pages of your stress diary that you have been making since a few days ago and try to look at what you have written there. You must have mentioned the episodes which were stressful. Then I also requested you to elaborate upon those episodes and try to find out what made you stressed. Why do you feel that you experience so much of a stress in that situation? Focus on that explanation and see how you try to attribute your stress. Whether you have written that because this happened in the situation, he says this, she did this, my mom, slapped me, or, she just threatened me for something. I felt bad. Or I missed the deadline of my assignment, so I felt bad. I got lower grades in my examination, I felt bad. Or somebody hit me at the road, I felt bad. My favorite things were broken, I felt bad. If you are giving this kind of explanation of feeling stress, means you are more towards stimulus perspective. If you are trying to analyze your own mechanisms, physiological and psychological, and attributing the stress reaction to them, maybe you are more towards the response perspective. And when you try to look at the dynamic transactions between you and the environment which was there that time, you are anchoring upon the transactional perspective. So try this and find out your own perspective of stress. These are the references which are cited in this presentation, and these are some books that you can refer to for further reading. Thank you so much for your kind attention.